Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege and honor to moderate this discussion with such a distinguished panel. In many ways, Mr. Panda has set the stage for this discussion. He has touched upon many issues that we'll build upon in this discussion. By way of just background, I just want to share a few perspectives so that before we move to the speakers, we have some background information. If you look at 10 years ago, 2013, there were about 101 countries which had data protection laws, either already passed or in the parliament being considered. Now that number is 154, and most of the additional 53 countries are in the global south. Even the 101 countries that had the laws have substantially, many of them have substantially redone the laws, amended them, or repealed and made new laws. So there's been a very dramatic 1 decade for data protection laws in this world, and especially in the global south, because many countries in the global south are seeing data protection laws for the first time. That's an advantage, but also disadvantages are coming with that. One big advantage of being new to this game of data protection is that you can try completely new approaches. You can have very innovative approaches. There's not much by way of path dependence. You can choose what model works for you. You can learn from others' mistakes as well. But there are also disadvantages. You have to build capacities from almost nothing. And there are difficult, complicated public administration challenges that emerge out of data protection. So if you have those capacities built in advance, it helps, which was the case, for example, in the Europe. They have been building data protection capacities for almost 3 decades. Uh, and data protection is a very interesting kind of regulation because there is quite a bit of market incentive at work, which can discipline firms to do better on that in many ways. But there's also a very dark side of it. There are many actors that are just simply intending to misuse data, not the legitimate firms and actors who want to serve the consumers, but also many who are not in that game. They're on the business of doing harm. Then there is public administration of data protection authorities, which plays a role in the way the data protection is done. And then there are political economy issues around power of firms to influence regulation and all. And all of this drama is playing out in different economies. And it's happening in a highly globalized context because data economy, digital economy is a very global economy. I mean, there's a lot of cross-border data flow and for good economic and technological reasons, which makes the data protection regulation a very interesting and challenging kind of regulation that you don't want to impose unnecessary costs on the data economy. At the same time, you want to ensure that your citizens are protected. There is some degree of checks and balances, and also some rights are protected, and so on. So with that background, I will move to my panel now. And we have two representatives who are practicing data protection authority leaders. I want to start with Ms. Kasayed. She is the first data protection commissioner of Kenya. And the law was passed in 2019, 2020 it started getting enforced. If you could describe briefly what is the approach that Kenya has taken towards data protection? What are the broad contours of the law and how are you going about building the data protection commissioner's office?
In terms of what we have done, thank you very much for that question and my fellow panelists. And it's really a great honor to be here today. I laughed earlier saying that looks like we are too female. I don't know whether it was by design on this panel. Anyway, having said that, it's been a journey. And interestingly, India started the journey perhaps earlier than us. And just to contextualize, and I said this earlier, the reason the Office of the Data Commissioner exists in Kenya was to address issues around data or digital identity. There was a strong push by civil society organization. And interestingly, the example that they kept giving was the one for India, that they weren't sure that issues around data protection would be taken into account. And that is what really propelled the push to have the Data Protection Authority in Kenya. I say that was a blessing for the country, which is a heart of innovation. Our president, who is here currently, has been keen on the issue of pushing Kenya to the next level. And what the biggest issue then becomes trust. That is one of the biggest challenges, dealing in an environment which ordinarily regulators are seen as pro-government. How can then the general public trust you to be able to protect their data? It must be by what you do. The other challenges that we have seen initially is, of course, like you have put it rightly, the issue around awareness creation, because we are seeing all forms and shape of data protection regulatory framework in the global south. Imagine we already are struggling with other basic needs. And now we've added to the menu data protection. And we expect that people to discuss. And like was very put up around issues around consent. Consent has become a significant issue in terms of e-commerce. And you're telling people, we now need your consent. Beyond that also, the other issue we see as a challenge is issues around data flows. And data flows in the global south center around issues of national security and issues around we as e-commerce, there isn't supposed to be any restriction in terms of how information moves from any jurisdiction. Yet in data protection, you must have a balance between what is good for the citizenry and then what is good in as far as e-commerce is concerned. That's the other challenge that we find ourselves as data protection authority. So on one hand, you have innovators who often say, you're restricting our space to innovate. On the other hand, you have national security, which says we must keep this data within our jurisdiction, because when you allow everybody to access our information, we are exposed as a country. And like India, we also under high threat of terrorism as a country. So as a data and a public which expects you to trust and change the environment and make sure that the information is safe, that's where we find ourselves as data protection authority in the south. Thank you.
Now I want to turn to Dr. Vima from Brazil. Dr. Vima, you were at GTS 2 years ago. You had just joined recently the Data Protection Authority there. And we spoke about this same issue. And at that time, you had mentioned that the priority at that time was to create awareness around data protection, to help firms comply with data protection, and less of stick, more of carrot was what, if I could put it in succinct terms. What has changed last 2 years? Is the strategy still the same, or has your approach and priorities shifted in the last 2 years? What is the approach to data protection that you have now in ANPD?
Thank you so much for your question, and it's a great honor to share the panel with the other distinguished speakers. I really wish I could join you in person, but maybe some other time, hopefully. So thank you for the question. And in fact, the last time we spoke, our DPA had just very recently been created. We were created in November 2020, so we are now just over 3 years old, still in our early childhood. And I would say that, in fact, for a country such as Brazil, that has over 230 million inhabitants and that does not have a long-standing culture of data protection, in fact, the issue of raising awareness and building capacity is, in fact, still very important. So we understand that our goal as a DPA is not specifically to apply administrative sanctions or fines, but in a more global manner to ensure compliance with the law and respect of data subjects' rights, because in Brazil we now have a fundamental right to data protection that has been formally enshrined in our constitution. So considering that our law is still fairly recent, and also that we are still a very small DPA, we have now approximately 120 permanent staff members, but our country is huge, so the proportion is still not so great. We, in fact, still have adopted this, what we call a responsive approach, a step-by-step approach. And our idea is that, in fact, we have different regulatory strategies that can be arranged in a pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, we have strategies that are perhaps less coercive, less interventionist, and more geared towards promoting compliance rather than simply applying administrative sanctions. So usually we begin with monitoring, guidance, prevention, and then finally repression. So we receive data subject complaints, we receive different information as to what's going on in the market, and then we will many times act through providing guidance, through issuing publications with orientation, with information as to what should be done. And our idea, in fact, is that organizations are able to respond to different incentives, and that through this step-by-step approach, we will be able to motivate cooperative behavior early on in the process rather than simply applying fines through lengthy administrative procedures. However, some things have changed, in fact, and our law, in fact, had a grace period that was slightly longer for administrative sanctions. This grace period has now ended. So we are now formally able to apply administrative fine, and we have already, in fact, begun doing so. As I mentioned, this is not our main focus, but of course, it's an important part of the regulatory toolkit in terms of promoting compliance. But I would say that it's perhaps not our main focus. We still have a very lengthy regulatory agenda, a number of other strategies and priorities we have to face before focusing, I think, with a more specific approach on administrative sanctions.
Thank you. So it's good to know that it's a gradual, responsive approach, and it's slowly moving towards a mix of penalties and awareness and capacity building. Mr. Panda, I want to come to you next, and many of these issues you've already covered in your keynote remark. But one point that you mentioned is that you see India as a leader of the global south on this issue of data protection and privacy. Uh, Maybe it's a provocative question, but I'll still pose to you that uh, India made its law this year, in 2023. It is 153rd and 154th country in the world to make a data protection law. And if you see India as a leader of the global south in this domain, do you expect that other countries will change their laws and adopt this model? And what sets this model apart from, say, what is being done elsewhere, which would make it so unique and so worthy of emulation? If I was to.
Well, I could be a little cocky and say we could have just adopted my bill 6 years ago, which had actually many months of consultations also with every stakeholder. But in fact, it was necessary for that that Supreme Court judgment, which ruled that privacy is a fundamental right. You know, our Constitution mentions fundamental rights, doesn't use privacy but it was an interpretation. But it also pointed out that there have to be certain narrow and very specifically defined exceptions. One of them is national security. One of them is to be able to provide governmental services. And until that happened, it was difficult to actually fill in the blanks for the regulations needed to come to where we have come today. Before I answer your question, I want to tell you that, even at that time, even 6 years ago, even earlier, we were already all used to, giving up our privacy. We had no problem using facial recognition on a smartphone, but many activists had fundamental differences with using facial recognition for security or things like that. So societal consent had to be built. Now, as I said, a lot of capacity development has happened in India. I mentioned our digital payments environment, which is the fastest growing in the world. Our biometric system and the payment system that it is linked to is already being used by a couple of other countries, has the scope to be used by many others. So we have this unique advantage, I think, of a trifecta of democracy, the largest democracy ever in human history. We have the scale, because there are very few countries that have hundreds of millions of population, and now nobody else has as much population as we have with 1.4 billion. And third is capacity. And the capacity building has happened especially over the last decade. So yes, we have a lot to share, and our attitude has always been about sharing. The philosophy that our Prime Minister has explained throughout the world of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is that the philosophy at the heart of the Indian belief system is that the whole world is one family, has been demonstrated, as I explained, during the pandemic, sharing vaccines, developing, rolling out in very large scale, helping nations with, I mentioned, building digital public infrastructure, especially the global south. India has taken it upon itself because we have made this journey. We have made this journey in a post-colonial world where we had a diffidence for many decades, even after gaining our independence, to transitioning to an era of confidence, but not in an aggressive way. Confidence in a way that is very keen to work in partnership with other nations. So apart from the kind of aid we have been giving, the kind of cooperation that we've been doing is, I think, important. And we've, on a slightly different platform than technology, Recently, in India's presidency of the G20, Prime Minister Modi took the initiative to have the African Union onboarded, because that's the kind of philosophy that we have. So yes, I think it is significant that we have started signing agreements with many countries from the global south, and we have already started signing agreements with developed nations, for example, in Singapore, for the use of our digital payment system. Um, uh, and as I mentioned during my remarks earlier, the fact that countries like Norway and South Africa, which are very diverse, one is very much a developing country, one is very much a developed country, and both of them finding India's DPDP Act as as worthy of emulation, I think is proof of the pudding that indeed this can be emulated, it can be shared, and our experience and capabilities today uh, can come to the aid of many other countries where India has a very open attitude about cooperating with them.
Mr. Armstrong, I want to come to you next. You're on the other side of the aisle, so Salesforce is a regulated entity. It processes a lot of personal data as well, and you work across many jurisdictions in the global north as well as global south. And because it's customer relationship management, so it's a lot of personal data goes through it. And you have a broad view, I'm sure, of data privacy laws being made and implemented across many jurisdictions. What are some of the good practices that you're seeing emerging in terms of different approaches being taken by different global south countries? What are the best practices in your view? And not just from Salesforce perspective in terms of less compliance for you, but also what's working better overall?
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here with all these with the esteemed panelists up here. It's a great opportunity. I am heading up the Salesforce JPAC privacy team, so I'm based in Tokyo, and it was only a year ago where I started covering India, so I've been learning a lot in the last period of time, and it's been just a wonderful opportunity to be here. At Salesforce, we trust is our #1 value, and we hear lots of discussion about trust here, which I think is very important. And from a corporate perspective, trust is really what we need to enable with our customers. We're a B2B business, and because they need trust with their customers, the consumers, the data principals. From our perspective, really interoperability is so important because the costs of compliance are quite high. And so what we're seeing, we see a lot of laws around that are very similar to GDPR. They take GDPR and modify it slightly for their unique needs. It's very interesting when you see India, for example, or China, for example, that really took a broad brush approach, looking at what's happening in the US, what's happening in Europe, and really figuring out what's right for them. And I look at the DPDP and it is so unique, and there's so much to learn still about it. And frankly, being here has been a wonderful experience to get a better understanding on things like consent and the approach that is being taken around consent, because I think my view of that term and how Mr. Panda just described it is different. I had an incorrect view, so I'm learning here about how it's being viewed from the Indian perspective. I think having the processor controller distinction running across the field, we see that in most laws, is very helpful. The other one, and again, this is going to what may be controversial, the data transfer discussion as well, which I appreciate. There are very much different views, and learning here from hearing the other panelists talk is very valuable insight. I look at what Thailand just recently announced, and Thailand announced some guidelines which would allow companies to modify their existing EU standard contractual clauses or use the ASEAN model clauses and just modify them slightly for the Thai experience, for the Thai jurisdiction, which from an industry perspective, that's extremely valuable because rather than having to do a complete analysis and figuring out what each step takes and how that could ripple through. And when you're a global company, when things start to ripple through, that can become very difficult quickly. So having that ability to just, we know what the European standard contractual clauses mean. We've had them, Microsoft has had them for such a long time. So then we look at the narrow issue around scoping it out to include Thai law and how that would work. That's a really big perspective that we think is really good, because we look at what happened in Europe with Schrems and data transfer mechanisms disappearing, being struck down by law. So having multiple options available, like what Thailand is performing, I think is something that we would find very helpful.
Mr. Arora, I want to ask the same question to you in a different way. So obviously Microsoft is also in many, many jurisdictions, but it's a global firm. It's one firm. It may have subsidiaries in different countries and all. And you operate globally, you build systems globally, you implement them globally. And you have different jurisdictions coming up with new laws almost on a regular basis, 50 plus laws in the last 10 years. So how has this changed your business? I mean, what new challenges are emerging because of this? And what are the ways in which countries are trying to work with corporations like Microsoft to find a balance, in terms of both ensuring that compliance is done and rights and protected, but also not making it too expensive to do that?
Sure. Thank you, and glad to be here. I think fundamentally a way to look at it is there are certain regulations globally which are aligned, and a few regulations, each country has some different nuanced perspective to it. Right? Now, what happens is for any corporation, when they build their business plans, a company like us or Salesforce, we have to stay compliant. There is no two options about it, right? We follow the law of the land. Simple. That's the bottom line. But what it does is, if there are too many variations in various jurisdictions, it makes compliance slightly hard. You have to put resources for it. So the cost of compliance goes up. Now, what that does for a large company is large companies can put resources for cost of compliance, but is it creating a kind of a barrier for smaller companies, startups, right? Maybe yes. So that comes to the point of saying, should we have more effort, especially maybe Global South, to make rules, regulations that are harmonized, that are not too far from each other, that are largely aligned, so that companies from one country can do business in other countries, right? We want to create many large companies in the Global South, and how do we build that development framework for them, and so that they can flourish, right? So I think harmonization of rules, regulations is one such things besides market access for many companies. And I think we should all strive to do that. Also, what happens is, like if you take the example of Global South, many countries have adopted similar practices also. For example, as Panaji said, that privacy as a fundamental right. So in many countries now, the data subject or the citizen's right is enshrined in law, which is a great thing, right? Good to do. Similarly, how data gets processed and the topic of consent has been made more thoughtful, more forthcoming, so that citizens know what consent they are giving for. And all these are great things because they make sure that the data is not being misused, and citizens and data subjects know what the data is being used for and the consent they're giving, right? But to the point of variations, as small variations can happen, good. Obviously, some variations will be there because each country is different. India will have its own point of view because we have a different, stakeholder, citizens, same with other countries. But I think more and more, if we can come together to have common elements, it eases the business, scope.
Mr. Panda, you wanted to also...
I wanted to add to something that was just said. This issue of does too strict a regulatory environment squelch innovation? Especially, does it affect startups very badly? This is a very live issue and it's been discussed continually over the past many years. My original proposal was to have differentiated regulatory requirements for startups and for large companies, especially those large companies which are similar to what used to be called utilities in the old days. So India has innovated, I think. We've come up with such a differentiated requirement in the DPDP, which is the idea of a consent manager. And this is for significant data fiduciaries. It's not for the run-of-the-mill company which handles your data. Another issue which used to be it still is somewhat debated, is the issue of localization. Now, I've explained why India has certain real concerns, but the fact is, we don't use this phrase so much anymore, that data is the new oil, but the fact is that data principles, all of us, ought to have ownership to our own data, which was not widely understood or enshrined in the regulatory environments earlier. And so the Indian DPDP does require at least co-location. If you are a large fiduciary, if you're a significant fiduciary and you have hundreds of millions of Indian citizens' data and it's all outside and it's possible that one day we will all lose access to it, that's not an acceptable situation. So at least there has to be co-location. And our act provides the ability for the government to intervene and restrict data sharing across to certain specific jurisdictions where, because of the concerns that we have. Finally, I want to say on the issue of protecting children, there's a clear differentiation. The US has a very low bar of 13 years above which no parental consent is required. From what I read, there are many abuses of that system. Where should the bar be set? The EU sets it at 16, India's DPDP sets it at 18. And these are some of the issues that I think each country will have to discuss and adopt for itself.
So I want to build on that. You mentioned this India's approach of a negative list, that the data will not flow to those countries, and you have to have localization in that case. Now, there is a challenge when you do build a data protection law and start building the authority, that a lot of data processing is happening globally. So even though the data belongs to citizens of your country, it's getting processed in some other country. And maybe by bad regulatory practices or absence of data protection law altogether, you will have harms happening to your own country citizens. One way is to maybe have a negative list, that you will not let the data flow to those countries. But then there's a whole gray area in between, right? Where you'll have to use other instruments to assert your jurisdiction over their processing, and say that this is the data that belongs to our citizens and it should be regulated and processed in the manner that we are saying it. What are the instruments that you are using, Ms. Kasait, in Kenya to assert this jurisdiction, that this is our citizens' data and it is our business to protect that?
Yeah, just to, let me say this, in the global south and especially in Africa, as Kenya as a lead in terms of data protection, we have taken certain steps to make sure we have the right balance between innovation and also protecting the rights of citizens. And that is one of them. Even though our data protection regulatory framework provides for data localization, it also has a rider which says you keep a copy in the country for specific category of data. One of the data that is categorized is citizen data, to take care of in the event that a country can hold so much data that has to do with the citizens. That is one of the precautions. The other issue, because you also have to remember that in terms of this era, there's a lot of cloud computing, and many countries will only invest. I mean, it's impossible for you to insist you must restrict all the data to be in that country. There's categorization in terms of data flows, whether it is binding corporate rules, adequacy. We have tried as much as possible as a country to provide for that. We gave the general principles in the law and went to general regulations to provide for nuances that are unique to Kenya. And we have classified in terms of to facilitate data flows between the different countries and to help innovation in as far as the country is concerned. From an African perspective, Since we've seen a tremendous growth in as far as data protection is concerned. I wear two caps. Besides being the data commissioner, I'm also the vice president of Network for African Data Protection Authority. We are seeing a keen interest. I think it's just some of the challenges, their technology is changing so fast at times, and also lack of resources. But one of the general consensus is harmonization of data protection regulatory framework across Africa. Some of the institutions that have done this is Smart Africa. There is also, just recently, African Union came up with a guidance in terms of data protection. It's steps. From where I sit, I see some of the greatest champions of seeing things move faster is economic blocks. I believe one of the places, because anyway, when it comes to data flows, the biggest beneficiaries are things to do with e-commerce. Economic blocks such as ECOWAS, SADC, East Africa Community will help us leapfrog in terms of making sure we have a harmonized way of data protection so that we don't see companies struggling in what I've been saying in terms of making sure they have harmonized data protection across the different aspects of Africa. Because it is, I can tell you, it can be a nightmare in terms of making sure that happens. The other thing that I would want to say, the role of other data protection authority, because you cannot regulate everything. What we have done as an institution, as a matter of strategy, besides not, our first year we spend a lot in saying, please comply, comply. However, even so you comply, you still have a responsibility to make sure that people are actually held accountable. We have fine institutions as part of making sure there's compliance. But beyond that, we have encouraged guidance notes. Guidance notes are much more flexible tool for data protection authority globally to help different industries appreciate what data protection is. We have guidance notes, we have guidance notes on different aspects. Consent, we have guidance notes on data protection impact assessment. We have a guidance note on electoral processes, which was a highly contested issue in the country. We continue to encourage collaboration with industry, having an open door policy, because if you want to influence that space, then you must keep your doors open so that you're encouraging participation of the industry, so that as you design data protection, regulatory framework, or any decisions, they inform industry and they are part of your decision making.
Thank you. Thank you for that very detailed and helpful answer. Dr. Wimmer, I want to ask the same question to you, but make it more about state capacity. So if you want regulatory assertion, you need to have regulatory capacity and at least some matching capacity, because you're regulating very large and complex firms with quite a bit of technological and economic capability. So the question I want to pose to you is very straightforward. What is your strategy for building regulatory capacity inside ANPD? What are you doing? What are you trying to do inside ANPD? What are you doing with partnership? And what are you basically leaving to completely external players to figure out? Like in India, we have a consent manager framework in which third parties will help data principals manage their consent. In a way that's extension of state capacity, but not being done by the regulator itself. What is the regulatory capacity strategy for ANPD?
That's a very interesting question, and I think the answer has two dimensions. One is international and the other is domestic. So I think most of the previous speakers have highlighted that it's important that we take into account this double nature, these two natures of data processing activity. So on one hand, we are speaking about protecting a fundamental human right. We're speaking about the idea of informational self-determination. But on the other hand, there are economic aspects related to data processing and the idea of not stifling innovation or creating bad incentives for the development of the economy. So I think that when we look at these two aspects, it becomes clear that it is important for DPAs not to act as barriers for data to flow, but for the enabling of data to flow, to be shared and to be used in a responsible manner, in an accountable manner, and taking into account public interest. So when we look at the international dimension of data processing, of course, there are huge challenges. Many of these have been highlighted by previous speakers, and I'd like to touch upon two of them. One has to do with the fact that many data protection laws have extraterritorial effects. This is true of the Brazilian LGPD, but also the GDPR and certainly many others. So our law will apply even if the data is not being processed in Brazil, even if the company is not located or based in Brazil or headquartered. And this creates, I think, challenges for companies that are many times dealing with multiple jurisdictions, but also for the DPA, because we have a real challenge in terms of enforcing our legislation when the data is being processed elsewhere and the company is not always very responsive to our approaches. And the second issue is that we have rules on international data transfers. So in Brazil, we don't have an obligation of hosting the data locally, but there are conditions for the data to be transferred. So for instance, adequacy decisions, standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, or other elements such as consent on specific cases, public policies, international cooperation, and so on. So this is, I think, quite a complex scenario. And in terms of providing effectiveness to our legislation, the way forward, in my opinion, has to do not only with seeking harmonization, which in some cases may be challenging, but overall, I think, looking at interoperability. So looking for mechanisms that will allow our legislation to work together with the legislation of other countries and to build cooperative relationships with DPAs in other jurisdictions. In the domestic scenario, we also have challenges that have to do with this very fragmented legal landscape we have, both in terms of different laws that may apply to one same situation, but also due to the fact that we have several different regulatory agency or public bodies that may be called upon to act when you have a case involving data processing. So also here in Brazil, we have worked very strongly on this idea of building interinstitutional cooperation mechanisms. So we have cooperation agreements with our antitrust body, with our National Consumer Secretariat, with the Supreme Electoral Court, with our National Ministry for Transparency, for instance. And this has the idea behind this is, of course, that we will be able to work on building interpretations that are consistent, that are cohesive, even though the law may apply across a very wide range of activities. And I think as a complement to this approach of seeking coordination domestically, we are also working very hard on fulfilling our regulatory agenda. So we have actually published a list of issues that we will be tackling over these 2 years. And they are, of course, very varied, going from very basic issues such as data subject rights that are still not yet quite clear in our legislation, but also to more complex issues such as artificial intelligence, for instance. And I think that for all of these issues, the idea of cooperation, coordination, not only domestically, but also internationally, is key in order to make our legislation actually be effective and to protect data subjects' rights.
Thank you. So my final question is to all the panelists on this issue that Dr. Wimmer ended with, of international cooperation and coordination for data protection. So in finance, we have the Basel framework, which tries to achieve some degree of harmonization on prudential aspects of regulation of finance across the world. What kind of a framework might be required, if any, for improving international coordination and cooperation on data protection, if there is a case for it? Just brief thoughts from each one of you. Mr. Armstrong, you first. Maybe a minute. We have just a few minutes to go.
Sure. You've detected I talk a lot. I think the more coordination and collaboration on a framework like this, I think would be very valued by industry. I think by having the kind of the set rules that apply across the board, in addition to helping us comply with our business and helping our customers comply, it really does allow a customer who has a amazing, great idea in India to expand to other jurisdictions without fear of those differences. And it really allows for global competition and disruption globally, which I think is something that we all should be in favor of.
In terms of framework, I think time has come for the Global South to begin coming up with its own framework that defines the nuances of how the Global South would like to see how data protection looks like. From a more regional level, economic blocks would be one way to fast track this conversation around data protection.
There's a widespread desire for uniformity of regulations, and at least among industry, it must be absolutely the top on the wish list. But the reality is not going to happen this week, and it's not going to happen any year this week for a long time. That's because it's a very complex subject and has enormous ramifications. I mean, look, the United Nations has been around for almost 80 years, and we still haven't achieved anywhere close to unanimity on a host of extremely important issues. And this issue of regulating data privacy, data security is second to none, really. So I think what Miriam Wimmer said is probably the path forward, which is interoperability, and not across the entire swath of regulations, but probably chunk by chunk. You know, interoperability on how banks ought to handle data, for instance, interoperability of regulations on certain aspects of AI. AI is so vast that you cannot even today visualize all the regulations necessary 5 years from today. But perhaps we can agree on how to regulate deep fakes, which is a current topic of hot debate in India. So it'll have to be subsets of entire data regulatory environments of different jurisdictions where I think we can achieve interoperability, and that should be the path forward.
If you look at the reasons why, like, DPAs across the globe, all countries, the technology moves so fast that they become resource constrained, right? And secondly, is there enough knowledge sharing happening between them on what are the threats they are seeing versus other countries seeing? And obviously, there are some common threats from data protection standpoint, cyber criminals, right? So I think 2 or 3 ideas. One is obviously DPAs across the country, can they have a common forum where they are exchanging best practices and ideas so that if one country DPA has encountered a particular threat and they have negated it, others learn from it fast versus waiting for it to happen to them, right? So a cross collaboration. Also, from a research and development standpoint, the private sector companies do spend a lot of resources on doing cutting edge research to keep the data safe, right? So I think a very strong, consistent, long running public private partnership model on making sure that everyone is invested together, DPAs, governments, and private sector, to safeguard data. I think these 2 things, if we can make some progress, can be very useful.
Dr. Weber, do you want to add to what you said earlier?
Yeah, I think this discussion has effects. We can look at it both when we think of different fields, as was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, such as financial sector, telecom sector, and so on, and also the idea of cooperation across different jurisdictions. So when we look at the challenges of new technologies such as AI, and we look at their impact in fields such as healthcare or the financial sector and so on, it's easy to realize that there may be important differences and nuances that need to be taken into account. And in this sense, I think it's a very good idea to explore mechanisms such as regulatory sandboxes or other mechanisms to have strong consultations with society and with affected groups in order to try and reach common ideas or common approaches that may be helpful when we think of data flowing across different fields and sectors and subject to sector-specific rules. The other aspect has to do with different jurisdictions and international cooperation. And here I'd like to build upon one of the previous speakers that mentioned the importance of strengthening regional networks or regional groups. So personally, I don't think it will be easy to have 150 different countries with the same legislation exactly, but maybe working initially within our region, we can seek for some level of harmonization and then work towards greater interoperability with other regions. And I think this is perhaps one of the ways forward we can look at over the coming years.
Thank you. So as I started by saying, this is a field that is changing very fast. We saw more than 50 new legislations, almost as many substantial redraftings and repeals of old laws. So and technology moving so fast that, data protection regulation will also have to keep up with it. And I'm glad that we got many insights. I want to thank the panelists for the insights today, and especially the practical insights about what went into making the laws, what goes into enforcing them, and what goes into working with the regulators and making sure that there's a right balance and the rights are protected, but also the business can go on to some extent. This story will continue. Almost every year at GTS we have something on this issue, and we continue to learn on and discuss about this issue. Thank you all for joining us today.